Okay, so the first thing that we want to talk about are what I've titled here, ecological niches and geographic distributions. As I say, we're going to start comparing and thinking in geographic space, which we're all used to. By that I mean latitude and longitude, you know, what you see on a map, versus ecological space. We're going to start thinking about this relationship between niches and distributions. So how do we estimate distributions? Okay, we often want to know something about a species distribution, right? I just picked this is a right at the start of Alfred Russel Wallace's Island Life book from the 1895. Fantastic maps like this. Okay, I hope it comes out reasonably clearly. These are distributions, map shewing. I guess that's how they spelt it. The distribution of true jays. So you've got a range of different species here, you know, and they're nicely coloured in. Here's the blue species, here's a darker green, here's a lighter green species. A species restricted to Japan, it seems. So we have some estimates of where we find a species, right? And sometimes we take that as, you know, okay, so that's the distribution of the species. But what we're going to step back and do is start thinking, well, how do you come up with these kinds of estimates? You know, often this was actually just a case of let's get a map and, well, we think it kind of, you know, is distributed in this area. Okay, but fundamentally we want to know something about the distribution of species. How do we actually come up with an estimate of what the distribution is? Here's a more modern example then. This is from the Map of Life. If you haven't played with the Map of Life, it's a really great resource that I would encourage you to have a look at. So it's obviously plotted here on it works within the Google framework for Google Earth, and what we're seeing here, this is just pulling up one example. I think this is the marbled salamander in North America. What we have here shown are occurrence records where we know the species has been found. These are often from museum records. You know, a record in a museum that has an XY coordinate associated with it. The species has been found in this locality. And those data, we'll talk a little bit about it later this afternoon, are from GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. But it's essentially sharing information mostly from museum records, or at least originally it was from museum records. So that's what we really know about the distribution, are point occurrences, XY coordinates, where that species has been found, where a specimen has been collected in the field, or, you know, someone's been out and observed, okay, so the species occurs there. Then on top of that, we've got this green outline, which is the range from the IUCN Red List, the data set associated with the IUCN Red List, that is another estimate of the distribution of the species. Okay, so that's a much more, you know, a broader, it's showing some areas where there aren't actually occurrence records from those sites that are known in the database, but we think that the species is found in those areas. So start immediately thinking, you know, how do you go from the occurrence records to an estimate, a kind of more broad estimate, drawing a polygon around the areas where that species is thought to be found? And start thinking as well, when is it found in those areas? Because, of course, the distribution is kind of transient. You know, distributions change over time. Distributions change at different times of the year. So what does it actually mean to have a distribution of the species? Okay, but what we do know are that the species has been found in these red blocks. Okay, what you can do in Map of Life, it's very cool, is it's basically a resource that's plotting data from different data sets. Okay, so what we did here was pull up some data from GBIF, which are the point occurrences. We pulled up this outline that I've been talking about from the IUCN's data set. What you don't see so well, but you can hopefully pick out, is there's a darker distribution map overlaid on top of that, which is from WWF, their database of where their data set thinks that this, you know, species is found. And you'll see, you know, they're broadly the same, but that distribution isn't identical. Okay, so start thinking, and it's fundamental to what we're doing when we're actually trying to estimate a distribution. What do we really know? What are the kind of difficulties that we're going to have in actually estimating the distribution? And this is, you know, kind of very latest data sets. We can pull data down from different sources, and, you know, we're getting different bits of information. We're getting where the species is known to have occurred at a particular point in time versus one estimate of the broad range of the species versus another estimate that happens to be, in this case, you know, a little bit broader. But, you know, is the species really found there? When is it found there? When was it found there? Okay. So one thing that I want to say really early on is make a distinction between correlative, what I'm going to term correlative, versus mechanistic approaches to estimating species distributions. And I'm also going to start talking a little bit more, not just about species distributions, but about ecological niches of species, okay? Two fundamentally different approaches to estimating distributions and niches of species. So, a correlative approach, or a more kind of statistical approach, if you like, is to say that we're going to assume that the current distribution of the species, which is absolutely fundamental, we're going to assume that the current distribution of the species tells us something, it's some indication of the ecological requirements of the species. Okay? Kind of makes sense, right? You would expect to, you know, if it's a species that likes a particular environment, that's its niche, then you would expect to find it in that environment. So we make a fundamental assumption that the occurrences where we find the species tell us something about the ecological requirements of that species. And that is the approach, in effect, that we're really going to focus on over the next couple of days. And it's the approach that's, for better or worse, most widely applied in the literature. And when you hear people talk about species distribution modelling or ecological niche modelling, they tend to, not always, and it's not necessarily the case that they should, but they tend to be thinking and talking about correlative approaches. That's what we're really going to dig into the detail of. There's a whole different approach out there that we can refer to as more process-based or a mechanistic approach, which is where we don't rely on the observed occurrence records to tell us what the ecological requirements of the species are. We don't say, well, this species is found in this particular environment, so we're going to assume that that's the preferred environment. You actually generate some sort of detailed physiological understanding of the niche of the species. So a classic example might be that you're interested in a particular plant, so what you're going to do is you're going to grow that plant in a greenhouse under a whole range of different conditions and see when it flourishes. Okay? So you might find that it dies above X degrees C or below X degrees C. It dies if it gets, if the ground frosts over. It dies if there's too much precipitation or if there's not enough precipitation. But you're actually going to find out in a more mechanistic way what the niche of that species is, rather than just saying, well, we find it in this environment, so we're going to, in nature, so we're going to assume that that's the environment that the species prefers. And a lot of the literature on this, from this kind of approach, is also really trying to dig into understanding the physiologically, be it a mammal or a plant, when do leaves stop being able to photosynthesize, and trying to understand the chemistry and the real physiology of the environments that a species can actually occur in, and looking at metabolic rates and these kinds of things. So two fundamentally different approaches, and they're going to tell us slightly different things, or actually often very, very different things. We're going to focus on correlative, because that's what the vast majority of the literature is. That was what I have more expertise in, and that's what we're kind of going to bite off for this couple of days. There's a really, really good review, Kearney and Porter in Ecology Letters from 2009. Again, the references are a little bit later on in the presentation, but you will have the full references in a minute, that really digs into the differences between them. So if you're really interested in this, I would flag to go away and have a look at that. To give you a brief overview, some of the reasons why, say correlative is one that we're going to focus on, and why it's the vast majority of the literature. One of the real practical reasons is that correlative models are a lot easier to run. We've already talked about, in some cases, they're kind of too easy to run, potentially. But we need to know something about the distribution of the species and the environment that the species is occurring in. We don't need to know about the physiology, about running the experiments and that. So these methods are applicable to a whole lot more species. Okay? It's much easier to run correlative methods for a much broader range of species than it is. We have the kind of understanding of relatively few species to run more mechanistic approaches. Okay? So there's a practical thing. If you're interested in addressing a large number of species, we often simply don't have this data, although in many ways, theoretically, this would be preferable, to understand it mechanistically and the processes as to how a species occupies its environment. They also, so that's one reason, just that you know, you can apply these methods to a lot more species. But the methods are also telling you something subtly different that we'll try and pick up through this series of discussions that we will have. Correlative methods are really telling us about the niches that the species actually occupies in reality, in the environment. This is the niche that the species actually is occupying, right? Whereas these mechanistic approaches are going to tell us more about the environments that the species could occupy. They might not actually occupy up to their full range of conditions that they could occupy, but we learn something more about what we might term like the fundamental niche of the species, okay? And it depends what you're kind of interested in. Is that what you really want to know? Often it is, okay? But sometimes, for example, those of us who are looking at more asking questions about speciation processes and differences in niches that organisms are occupying, we might actually be more interested in the actual niche that the species does occupy. So I'll put that out there as a thought now, and hopefully that will come clearer. But fundamentally, there are these two very different approaches to asking about modelling niches and distributions, and we're going to focus on, but we can continue discussing and contrasting with, we're going to focus on correlative approaches, more statistical approaches, but bear in mind that there's a different approach out there that you can take and you might want to. I think we might come back to this particular slide a few times, but fundamentally this is just one. You're going to see a few examples of Madagascar. It's one of my main interests. I know there's at least one other person in the room who has an interest in Madagascar, so I'll just throw that up as it'll be kind of one of the key examples that we'll look at. But this is in effect what a species distribution model is, and we'll talk about this probably at length. On this particular slide I'm calling it an ecological niche model. Okay, just bear that in mind at the moment. What's the difference between a distribution model and an ecological niche model? We're going to talk about that more theoretically or in practice. In what you're actually doing, it's the same thing. Okay, but the interpretations is a bit more than semantics. It's actually what are we trying to get out? Are we trying to get a niche or a distribution? Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. But I'm turning an ecological niche model on this slide. So what ultimately is this kind of correlative niche distribution modelling approach, or bioclimate envelope model was another term that's been thrown out there. So, as I've said, we know something often about the distribution of the species. What we often just know as some occurrence records, we know some localities where that species has been found, right? In this particular case, we have very few of them, but these are records of a particular gecko from Madagascar that, you know, I was sat in the office at the American Museum of Natural History. These are in jars in the collections within our department. Those specimens have labels that have XY coordinates, so we can plot them on a map where that species was found. And it might have been a long time ago, but we at least have some estimates or some real records of where the species has been found. So that's a fundamental bit of information. We know something about the distribution of the species. What we also know about, a lot in many cases, is the environments in the landscape. Okay, particularly, and one of the reasons there's been a big kind of burgeoning in this literature in the last few years is just the amount of environmental data that's become available is fantastic in many ways. So we have temperature and precipitation records across the whole of the planet at kind of 1 kilometre resolution. We can discuss quite how accurate they are in different parts of the world where there's not many weather stations, but we can have these huge databases with, you know, fine resolution estimates of temperature, precipitation, soil type, where rivers are, where lakes are, where roads are, where human populations are, what the elevation is, what the aspect is, what the slope is. Loads of information coming from remote sensing. Now, a lot of my work in the last few years has been funded by NASA. We always think about NASA being looking up, you know, away from the planet, but actually there's a lot of work, a huge budget and a huge amount of work that's on Earth observation. Okay, so it's actually turning the satellites to look at Earth using remotely sensed information to tell us about, you know, where the forests are, what the condition of the forests are, where the cloud cover is, very fine resolution, temporal data as well. So we often have, you know, monthly data or daily data or hourly data. So huge amounts of data that tell us about the environment. And we're often storing that data in geographic information systems. So again, it's another kind of technological advance in the last few years, just the amount of data that we can store computationally, gigabytes, terabytes of data that we can store, we can analyze, we can manipulate, that, you know, not that many years ago we simply couldn't do, certainly, you know, on a desktop machine. Okay, so we know something about the distribution and we know something about the environment. So then what we're going to do with this correlative distribution model, SDM or ENM, ecological niche model, is we're going to say something along the lines of that the probability of a species occurring at a particular point in space is some function of the environmental conditions at that locality. Okay, so this is just a very generic form. Why? What's the probability of the species occurring is some function of x1 might be temperature, x2 might be precipitation, x3 might be NDVI, which is a remotely sensed variable that tells us about, in effect, the amount of greenness at a particular point. That tells us about vegetation cover. So the probability that a species occurs at a particular point is some function of the environment in that locality. So the probability of a plant occurring depends on what at this locality the temperature is, the precipitation is, how cold it gets in the year, how much precipitation there is in the year, what other, you know, any number of variables, the kind of things that we've talked about at that site. So that's, in effect, that's what our model is. Once we've built our model, we can then draw a map, and this is in effect what you get out when you've pressed your button in your software, in R or in Maxent interface or something. We plot that back geographically. So this is some function in environmental space, and then we plot that back geographically, where we say for every point in the landscape, and we tend to think about cell-based landscapes, you know, pixels, or those of you who are accustomed to working with GIS data, think raster data. So the whole world is divided into pixels of a particular resolution, often a kilometre square or half a kilometre square or 10 kilometres square. But within a particular cell, we say, you know, does this cell meet the requirements of the species? Or what, based on our function, on our model, what's the probability that the species would occur at this site? Okay? The example I've given here, and we'll talk about this, as created a binary prediction that the environment is suitable or the environment isn't suitable. We'll talk about how to do that, but in a sense, you know, you're going from a probability that the species will occur to just a prediction the species or the habitat is suitable versus the habitat isn't suitable. So we go from some knowledge about the distribution and the environment, we build a relationship between the two, and we project that back geographically. So all of the environments that the model is saying, that I've coloured in orange or yellow here, we're saying that is our distribution model, or that is our niche model. What that really means, and we'll emphasize this, what that really means is those areas that are mapped there, that are coloured there, we're saying have environmental conditions that are similar to where we've already found the species. Okay? That's what these models are showing. These areas shown here have environmental conditions that are similar to where we've already found the species. I've said that twice, and I know I'm emphasizing things because that's kind of key to what we're talking about here. It doesn't tell us any more, it doesn't tell us any less. Is that the distribution of the species? We're going to talk about that. Is that tell us something about the niche of the species? We're going to talk about that, okay? But ultimately, all this is doing is telling us that these areas here have environments, they have temperature, precipitation, whatever variables we used within our model that are similar to where we've already found the species. All we're doing here. All right? So stepping back, let's start thinking a little bit more about some kind of fundamental thinking about what determines a distribution. So we often refer to this as a kind of BAM diagram. Biotic, abiotic, and movement. It's just a conceptual. We're not thinking now, it's a conceptual kind of Venn diagram. It's not geographic, it's not even in ecological niche space, but what are the factors that determine a species distribution? Okay, well, we can break it down into the abiotic environment. Okay, that means in effect kind of the physical environment. That's what the temperature is, what the soil's like, what the precipitation's like, what the slope is like, how high you are, what the elevation like. So those are all abiotic factors that constitute a species niche, if you like, and determine where we're going to find a species. Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it in between? Is it wet? Is it dry? Is it wet and hot? Is it, etc. Another factor, of course, is the biotic environment, by which I mean the ecological communities within which species function. Okay? Those of you who have ecology backgrounds will have probably looked at these kinds of things before, and we tend to think about two very different sets of literature. The term niche is a term that is very widely debated, very often abused or misused, but has very many different meanings. And to caricature it a little bit, part of that is that people come from two very different kind of backgrounds, but use this same term. So when we often, and we'll talk about this in the next few slides, but what we're more going to focus on, but it's not necessarily the case, is this abiotic environment. And that's those of us who've kind of come from a background of macroecology, biogeography, and we're thinking about the abiotic environment, the fundamental niche of the species. We're thinking about authors like Grinnell and Hutchinson, going back to the earlier on in the 1900s. We'll refer to Grinnellian niches or Hutchinsonian niches. This is thinking about what are the abiotic conditions, what are the abiotic conditions that constitute a species niche. Those of you who come from more, we might refer to it as an Eltonian background or an Eltonian niche, the writings of Charles Elton, where really your concept of what a niche is a species placed within the biotic community. So a species niche is really about what role it plays within the biotic community, who's eating who, where it sits within the food web. Okay, two kind of different ways of conceptualizing niches, and what's been happening, I think, in the literature in more recent years is trying to put those two different concepts together. But, you know, they're both, in effect, different elements of what we might term the niche of the species, the abiotic niche of the species and the biotic niche of the species. In order for a species to be found at a particular locality, you kind of need to satisfy both of those requirements. The abiotic conditions have got to be right, and the biotic elements have got to be right. You know, if you, by biotic, I mean, you know, if you occur in a particular locality, probably you've got to have your source of prey there, or you've got to have some symbiotic relationship that you have with a plant or with some other species. You know, that part of the biotic community has got to be there as well if you as a species are going to occur there. So all I'm saying here, and what we're conceptualizing, is you need the abiotic conditions and you need the biotic conditions, and then this is the kind of area that you're actually potentially going to find your species, where both sets of conditions are satisfied. Yeah? Straightforward. There's another element to this that we'll term movement or dispersal. It relates as well to history and speciation and things. But this is, in effect, what are those actual environments that the species has physically had the opportunity to sample and to occupy. So there might be parts of the abiotic space where the environment is suitable. Sorry, I'm looking at it in the wrong way. But there may be parts of the abiotic space where the conditions are suitable, but the species hasn't actually had the opportunity to get there. So that would be this whole region around here. Temperature and precipitation are okay, but the species hasn't actually been able to occupy it. So where you're actually going to find the species are where these different conditions are all met. The abiotic conditions are right, the biotic community is right, and the species has actually had the opportunity to disperse there. Okay, kind of fundamental, but just, I think, a useful way of conceptualizing where you're going to find a species and what constitutes the niche of a species. Here's another way of looking at a really cool paper that I'd encourage you to look at. Ronald Pulliam back in 2000 that is a really excellent review of this kind of issue of niches versus distributions. Another way of looking kind of at things that I've said. So now we're actually going to start plotting things on and looking at species and distributions in environmental space. Okay, So our axes here are environmental axes. Okay, E1 might be temperature, E2 might be precipitation. When we think about niches and you look at the literature, we'll often think about kind of n-dimensional hypervolume is one of the cool terms that's used in effect. To say, you know, this niche is some hypervolume, some volume that the axes of which are the environmental variables, and you know you can build up this hypervolume with as many variables as you want to throw at the situation. Of course, often when we're looking at it, we can just look at it in 2 dimensions because it's simpler to plot. Some of the plots that we have are in 3 dimensions because obviously we can visualize that. Once you get beyond that, we can't visualize it. But that's all we're doing here. We're breaking it down and just thinking, well, suppose we just look at 2 dimensions of this ecological niche space. The crosses here are occurrences of the species, where we have records that the species has occurred, and the little circles are absences of the species. Something else we're going to come back to when we have presence information and when we have absence information. Okay, so this is a classic. I've already mentioned Joseph Grinnell and Hutchinson. This is one way of visualizing it. The classic Grinnellian niche, or the fundamental niche, is to conceptually say, well, let's just draw some sort of shape around our occurrence records, and within that space, that's where we're going to find the species, where a particular set of conditions are satisfied. So where it's not too hot, and it's not too cold, and it's not too dry, and it's not too wet, for example. So that's the fundamental niche of the species. It's kind of when we were thinking about mechanistic approaches a few minutes ago, that's kind of what you're going to get from a mechanistic approach, right? You're going to have a good effort at estimating the fundamental niche. Realized niche is probably a term that you've already come across. Hutchinson was first to, I think, really make this distinction between a fundamental niche and a realized niche. That is to say that suppose, you know, within our fundamental niche of the species, we're going to have some absences. And one of the reasons that we might have some absences is, suppose this is the fundamental niche of a competitive species, shown here in this dotted outline, that's outcompeting this species from part of its fundamental niche, then it's going to exclude it, and the species is then only going to occupy part of its fundamental niche that we will refer to as the realized niche. So fundamental niche is, in effect, the abiotic conditions that the species could occupy. The realized niche is in the presence of other species where the species is actually occurring. Okay? A couple of complications on top of that. This idea of source sink dynamics, which is to say that you're most likely going to find that there are some occurrence records that might be found outside the fundamental niche of the species. Just bear this in mind. So the idea of a source sink dynamic, and we've heard a little bit before about metapopulation dynamics, it's related to that, is that these might be localities here where the species has been found, or localities in environmental space, conditions that you found the species in, but they're not actually where the species is long-term maintaining and reproducing and maintaining a population. So these might be just, say, foraging sites where a bird has, you know, been found, or, you know, it's just a transient record where the species was passing through, but it's not actually using that environment. So bear that in mind with some of your species, particularly highly dispersive species. Are all your records really telling you something about the part of the niche that you want to know about, or have you got a lot of kind of source sink dynamics going on, such that a lot of your populations are not source populations within the fundamental niche, but are sink populations outside, not really populations, really just records outside the fundamental niche. And then dispersal limitation as well. Think back to the band diagram where we talked about movement being important. You're going to get localities within your fundamental niche of the species where you don't actually find that the species occurs, because it might not have actually sampled, it might have not have moved to and sampled those environments. Okay? So it's not as simple as get species localities within the niche, within the fundamental or realized niche. There's a bit more to it than that, and we'll come back to it. Source sink dynamics and dispersal limitation. And one thing to bear in mind that we're going to come back to is, what are our absence records really telling us then? Right, so here's a diagram that hopefully will try to clarify some of these things. So now we're going to start thinking in geographic space and in environmental space. There's no scale here, there's no, it's just think conceptually, right? So this is geographic space. These are our x and y coordinates. This might be latitude and longitude. It might be any number of projection systems around the globe, but it's a map. So this could be, depends on our species, these could be mountaintops. They could be lakes. They could be large scale, they could be small scale. Doesn't matter. Conceptually, it's a map. And what it's showing is, again, little crosses where we know the species has occurred. Known species occurrence records. And we can plot them geographically, and we can pick up that point and calculate, you know, what the environments, and this point, what the environments that the species is occupying, and we can plot them in environmental space. So again, environmental variable 1 might be temperature, might be soil type, whatever, and environmental 2. Soil type isn't a good example. Soil, some property of the soil, pH or something like that, because we have a continuous variable there. Okay? So again, the occurrence records. Now that is all we know about the species, right? All we know, in most cases, is where the species has been observed. XY coordinates, where the species has been observed. We can plot it geographically, we can plot it environmentally. So let us now think conceptually, what else might we want to know, or what else do we know about the species? Well, coloured, kind of shaded here. Let's look at these shaded areas. Conceptually, what I'm trying to get across here is those are the areas that we might call, they're called different things in different places, but the occupied distributional area. Really, it's the actual distribution of the species. So that is where the species, in actual fact, is found. Okay? Now notice that we don't actually know that, because all we know about are the occurrence records. So notice that there are some parts of the actual distribution of the species, the shaded grey area, don't have any records for. Okay? It's the reality in many of the situations that we're working with. Now, much like we could plot the occurrence records geographically or in environmental space, we can do the same with this idea of the actual distribution or the occupied distributional area. We can plot that in environmental space. So again, the shading here is that's saying that those are the environments actually that the species really is found in. Again, we don't know that. All we know are the occurrence records, but that's where the species actually is found. And we're going to, you'll hear it called different things. We're going to call it the occupied niche space, or really it's pretty much the realized niche. Technically, I think we could argue that it's not really the realized niche if you look at the literature. But those are the kinds of terms that you will find. And I'm picking up most of my terminology either from an article back in 2007 that I wrote, or really more lately, the book that I will show you, Peterson et al., that we put out back in 2011. That's probably the closest that we have to a kind of textbook for this course. But don't get hung up on the terminology. Think about the concepts here. We've got the actual distribution and the realized niche, or the actual niche that the species is occupying. Okay? What else have we got? I'm going to refer to it as the abiotically suitable area. But what I've drawn around here, the solid lines, are basically saying those are where in the landscape the environment is actually suitable for the species. The abiotic conditions meet the requirements that the species needs. So if you think about it as maybe these are mountaintops, then maybe these are the cooler areas on the top of the higher areas where the species is actually going to be found. So the species, we might not have records from some of those areas, as I've said, but equally the species might not actually be occupying some of those areas. Right? So this is the difference between the actual distribution of the species versus the abiotically suitable area. Species isn't actually found there. If you went there, you wouldn't find it. If you went there, you would hopefully find it. And similarly, we can plot it all in environmental space. Okay? So we can plot what's shown here as the solid outline. We're here going to call it, in effect, the fundamental niche. the longer, posher term that is explained in the Peterson et al. Book, we would refer to it as the sinopoetic existing fundamental niche. I'm not going to get into that now. In effect, these are the environmental conditions. It's the fundamental niche where we could potentially find the species. That is really the closest that we can get to the fundamental niche. Okay? So we've got occurrence records that we can plot, we've got the actual distribution, and we've got these ideas of abiotically suitable areas, both in terms of the occupied, the abiotically suitable area literally as in the geographic area that the species occupies, versus the fundamental niche, the range of conditions, not necessarily where the species does, not necessarily that the species does occupy, but where it could potentially occupy. Okay? So, what's in a name, if you like? And I've touched on this a little bit. We've called this course species distribution modelling. It's widely a name widely applied in the literature, but you've also heard, and a few of you have used it, ecological niche modelling. We've also heard bioclimate envelope modelling, habitat suitability modelling. Okay, you'll see these terms used in the literature, and they're mostly just interchangeable. Okay, people are referring to, in effect, the same methods that we are discussing: correlative estimates of this idea of the distribution or the niche. But you're already seeing: are we estimating the distribution or are we estimating the niche? Okay, so it's largely semantics. It's largely just people using a term, but there is a bit of a underlying issue here. Are we trying to estimate the distribution, or are we trying to estimate the niche? So before we grab coffee, just think about that. What do you think, and what do you think from your applications? Are you trying to do species distribution modelling? Are you trying to do ecological niche modelling? Think about geographic space versus environmental space. What are you trying to estimate in the kind of things that you're doing? Do you want to know, remember, all you've got really are occurrence records. All you've got are some estimates or some records of where the species has been found. They might be little polygons because we know its species is found in a particular forest or something, but they're pretty local records of where the species has been found. What are you trying to do with your studies, with the questions that you're trying to ask and answer? Do you want to know something about the distribution, or do you really want to know something about the niche? So you'll see that in the literature, and it is kind of just semantics. People will throw around the different terms to see the same thing, but there's a bit more of an underlying question here. What are you trying to do? So if you're really interested in building a reserve to protect a species, maybe do that over, kind of multi-taxon reserve planning where you're trying to conserve species within a particular area in a biodiversity hotspot, you probably want to know about the distributions, right? You want to have an estimate of where the species is found so you can put a fence around them and protect them. But if you're interested in, say, an invasive species, where could it invade if it landed somewhere? If that movement requirement was overcome and you actually translocated a species to an area, where could it potentially distribute? Well, then you're kind of a bit more interested in the abiotically suitable area. What's the potential for that species to actually occupy a different part of the geographic space? Or if you're really interested, as I know some of you are, in more speciation processes and niche evolution, then you're really interested in the actual environmental space here. You're interested in the two populations or two subspecies or two species or two whatever your taxonomic groups are. Do they have similar niches or different niches? Do they overlap? Where are they in the landscape? So this issue of distribution modelling versus niche modelling is actually kind of important, and a fundamental thing that you need to ask: what are you trying to estimate when you do these models? For your application, what are you trying to get out of the models? Are you trying to estimate distributions or niches?